I would recommend everybody watching a video that was put out by the Baileys. In fact, I would recommend watching pretty much all of their videos. And they took a look at what they called the 5 most common criticisms from the so-called freedom community about the so-called no virus people like ourselves. I guess that's what they call us. And just the absurd anti-scientific nonsense that these supposed men of science and medical doctors and PhDs and virology professionals say to us in order to supposedly prove or convince us that viruses exist and cause disease. They're actually so absurd that I don't think they're actually directing them at us, because there's no way that we would believe any of this. So they must be directed at common people who, if they don't think about it clearly, might fall for it. So let me just make a comment on a couple of these. Some of you probably have heard this if you've had conversations with people who try to tell you you're crazy for saying there's no such thing as a virus. So this guy who apparently, I haven't heard much of him lately, but I think his name is Richard Fleming, who's a medical doctor, I believe a lawyer, and I believe a virologist of some sort, who therefore should know something about it, and his influential in the freedom community, goes on and says, so if these people think there's no virus, how about if they go to a room and have the CDC vial containing smallpox, and we'll put them in a room and expose them to the contents of this vial and see if they survive this smallpox exposure from obviously the smallpox virus. And so when you think about that and you think, wow, that's a pretty interesting challenge, but let's unpack that story a little bit. So he's saying that the CDC has vials which they allege cause our smallpox viruses that allegedly cause the disease called smallpox and would therefore kill us. And he's assuming that we would be too scared to go in that room. The interesting thing about that question is it's actually not about virology. It's about would we be willing to be exposed to a CDC vial containing we don't know what? So let's try to be a little bit scientific about it and say, if we want to make this about viruses and virology, let's expose ourselves to the smallpox virus. So you allege, Dr. Fleming, that there is a smallpox virus in that vial from the CDC. In order to prove that to us, because exposing us to a vial containing all kinds of dead cells and toxic stuff, that's not about virology, that's toxicology. And obviously no one wants to be exposed to arsenic and whatever else, dead kidney cells that they put in those vials. So how about this? How about if we take the virus out, as any scientist would do, and we show that there's a virus in there, and then we will allow you to expose us to only a purified virus. So how do you do that? So you take the CDC mixture, and the first step is you purify the particle from that mixture that you allege is the smallpox virus. We don't actually think there is any smallpox virus in that vial. We think that is a toxic brew of we don't know what, because they won't disclose that. So then once you have purified particles and show us the picture on the electron microscope that the only thing you have in that, from that vial, from the vial, is not anything else but only isolated purified virions. Then you have to show us that those particles, which are pure, are actually viruses, and in fact, actually the smallpox virus. In order to do that, you have to demonstrate that those particles, which you have purified from that mixture from the CDC, have a protein coat and that they have a genome, and that all of the proteins that make up those particles are coded for by that genome. That's what you say about a virus. So demonstrate that. Take those particles, that's all you have is particles, nothing else in there. They are absolutely pure particles. You prove that to us. You show that they're all identical because you say that these virions are clones of each other. They should have identical shape, morphology. They should have identical proteins, and all of the proteins should be coded for by that genome. You then take the genome out of that particle, which is easily doable, and you show that the genome has a certain length, and all of the particles have an identical genome. After all, you say they are clones and that they are identical smallpox viruses or virions. So now you have established, A, there is a purified particle. They are all identical. They all have a protein coat and genome in the inside. All of the proteins are coded for by that genome. Then you show these particles are able to replicate in cells, as you say viruses can. So you inoculate those on cells, and then you show that they grow and produce more of the same. Again, you purify the results of that, show that they have the same morphology, have the same proteins, have the same genome, and all the proteins are coded for by that genome. Then you introduce that virus and only that virus to an animal model, show that the animal gets sick in a disease at least similar to what you call smallpox, and then you can isolate the virus and purify the virus with all those steps of showing identical particles with identical genomes, all of the proteins coded for by that genome. So then you have shown that that particle is a virus, it is infectious, it does cause disease, and it can be re-isolated from the animal that you made sick. And then you have a vial of pure, isolated, proven smallpox virus. And then I'd be happy for you to spray it on me, because Richard Fleming, there is no way you could do any of those steps, because it's not something that virology can do, not because it is impossible technically or in a laboratory to do those steps. All those steps are routine procedures for particles, the size and shape and composition of viruses, but for the simple reason that no smallpox virus is present in that toxic brew, and nobody in their right mind would want to be exposed to any of the toxic brews that the CDC is cooking up in their laboratory. This is exactly the same reasoning as when people ask me and maybe asked you, but Tom, so you'd be willing to have sex with somebody dying of AIDS? So first of all, I'm happily married and not interested in having sex with anybody else but my wife, for one. And second of all, I'm not interested in having sex with somebody who is dying of AIDS. And even if I did, where is the proof of the virus in that? How do you know it's not something else to do with the sexual encounter? And the obvious scientific answer for that is you don't, because there is no independent variable called a virus which you can test. And so you're not testing a virus, You're testing exposure to a whole lot of things, including an intimate act and all kinds of fluids with God knows what in it. None of this has anything to do with demonstrating that there's a virus or not. Or the same, you sometimes get the question, would I be willing to have a blood transfusion from somebody dying of AIDS? The answer is no. It has nothing to do with viruses. I would certainly be willing to, using the same method of purification of and demonstration of the existence of HIV. I'm actually not that interested in being injected with anything, but once you can find, purify, isolate, demonstrate, characterize HIV, then sure, I would be happy to be injected if that's all you have. But since we know that's not possible, that will never happen. But what about blood? Are you suggesting, Dr. Fleming and the other people who say this, that the only thing in blood is an HIV virus from a person dying of AIDS? If you are, that is a unbelievably uninformed opinion about the composition of blood. And so that is not the variable you're testing. You're testing, would you be willing to inject yourself with some foreign proteins and foreign blood and God knows what, because the person's dying of AIDS? And the answer is obviously no. I don't want to be injected with anything, frankly, and certainly not the dying blood of somebody dying of AIDS or the toxic blood. There is no evidence in any of those stories that we're dealing with a virus. And somehow the freedom scientists can't seem to understand that. And that's fine. I'm not actually interested in whether they can understand it, but I am interested in whether you can, and that you know what to do with that question if it arises for you, because that question tells you more about the insight and the intelligence and the understanding of the questioner than it does about whether you be willing to do a ridiculous experiment that can prove nothing about virus.